Welcome back, everybody, to Law of the European Union. In this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about the history of the European Union in something of a brief and overview-like fashion, because, of course, the history of the European Union could be, and probably will be, a series of lessons in and of itself in the future. So we're going to take a brief overview at the key stages of European integration, European development, European enlargement in terms of further members of the European Union being added, and then you could argue a contraction of the European Union with the removal of one of its member states, that being, of course, the United Kingdom in Brexit. So, like I said, we're going to talk in more detail about the historical development of the Union itself, the ways in which it developed from a small collection of states that regulated a small variety of industrial outputs to the massive supranational institution that exists to this day, with very complex and integrated legal systems and complicated methods and modes and competences. So, in terms of the early history and its origins, the ideas of European integration are nothing new. They didn't come out of the 20th century, they actually came out of the 18th and the 17th and the 16th centuries, the idea of linking countries in the European sphere together. However, when we talk about the creation of the European Union specifically, and the ideas of integration gaining more and more prominence and traction, we have to think about the end of the Second World War. The Second World War, of course, being the last great war that takes place in Europe between the vast majority, if not all, of the European states. Now we have new wars that are taking place in Europe. In fact, there is one war particularly that's taking place right now in Europe at the time of recording. Of course, this is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But in terms of European-wide conflict that has taken place, nothing was quite like the Second World War, and hasn't been since the Second World War. And so post the Second World War, post the sheer destruction that was the Second World War, and post the sheer atrocities that took place in the Second World War, things notably like the Holocaust, there is this growth in ideas relating to not only European integration, but internationalism more generally. It's obviously where we see the establishment of the United Nations, we see the establishment of major international human rights treaties, we see the establishment of things like the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo IMT as well, and all these different kinds of developments in terms of the prosecution of international crimes. All of these things start to explode. In fact, if you are a student of international law, or if you follow the International Law Academy as part of our collection of channels, you will know that a lot of international law that exists to this day comes out of and post the Second World War. So, of course, internationalism is a very big thing, and so too is the idea of European integration. Not only was there a belief that a war like World War II should never happen again, which is a belief which, at least I hold, and many other people do still hold to this day, but there was also the growing trend towards international organizations being formed. So we have things like the Bretton Woods organizations, which were the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. You had the failed International Trade Organization and the Havana Charter, but that was sort of superseded by the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which would eventually turn into, in the 90s, the World Trade Organization. So you could almost suggest that the World Trade Organization is almost an ancestor of the Bretton Woods organizations. But then you also have things like the United Nations as well. Couple this with the fact that post-World War II there is a major wave of decolonization. This takes place across all European empires. The British Empire contracts, the French Empire contracts and loses grip on its territories. That's why we get things like the Vietnam War, for example, and all the other empires that existed in the Americas, in Asia, as well as Africa, starts to contract, and we start to see the collapse of these major world empires. You have a situation where there was a seeming need for European states to, rather than looking outward towards their Commonwealth, towards their colonies, like the Britain and France, for example, they need to look inwards towards the internal domestic affairs of their own state, as well as the internal affairs of their own continent, i.e. European states. And this All of these things coupled together to create a situation where we are seemingly looking for European states to examine ways in which they can better integrate with other European states. Some of these commitments to create European institutions takes place as early as the Moscow Conference of 1943, so before the end of the Second World War itself, and indeed the Yalta Conference of 1944. So in those conferences, for example, there was an agreement among the great powers to establish something known as the European Advisory Committee. But it isn't until the Treaty of Rome in 1958 that we see the major movement towards European integration. The Treaty of Rome was the first major establishment of what would eventually become known as the European Union, and it establishes something known as a European Economic Community, the EEC. And the EEC would be signed by the following states: Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, West Germany. Okay, these are the original founding members, the founding fathers, if you will, of the European Union, as they were the original parties to the Treaty of Rome. West Germany, of course, because Germany at this stage was divided into two, owing to the end of the Second World War and the Potsdam Agreement to divide Germany up into the various different states in which it became, and the different zones or spheres of influence. The Treaty of Rome would also establish a customs union between these member states. Now, for those of you who haven't ever studied international trade law or the World Trade Organization or anything like that, essentially a customs union is a set of preferential trade arrangements that exists in a union of states that are between, whereby the union itself controls the external agreements with other states. So there is a lower, more preferential trade barrier system inside the union of the customs union than there is outside of it. That's essentially what a customs union is. Of course, there are much more legally technical, legally savvy definitions of customs unions as defined in the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, but we are not going to talk about that in this series of lessons. The general idea here was that if we were to see the major countries of Europe interlinking major elements of their economies, then there is less chance for these countries to feel the need to go to war. Because if, for example, their coal, steel, iron industries are all linked together and controlled supranationally by an institution like the European Economic Community, then it is more difficult for them to go to war with each other, given the fact that they could just as easily go about negotiations for trade instead. In and around the same time, we also see the integration of energy unions. Now, Euratom and the sort of European Atomic Energy Union, or whatever it's called, specifically Euratom itself, is one of the most overlooked areas of European law, because for the most part it is sort of just sitting in the background in terms of the regulation that it does, because it obviously only specifically regulates a very niche element of energy union. Because in the same time as the Treaty of Rome, member states also signed a pact with the European Atomic Energy Community, Euratom. What's interesting here is Euratom was originally not on the table in terms of membership to the European Union and the Brexit negotiations, and then it became part of the negotiations to leave Euratom as well as the European Union, despite the fact that they are technically different elements or different institutions to an extent. Ultimately, what Euratom was supposed to do, the purpose of Euratom is to create a cooperative community in the creation of this new nuclear technology. Don't forget, 1958 we're talking. And so, therefore, we're talking about nuclear and atomic energy. We will get to studying Euratom when we talk about European nuclear law or European energy law in more detail in future lessons' time. So this laid the groundwork. So far we have the Treaty of Rome, we have Euratom, we have the original founding member states of the European Union. Now let's think about the methods and processes by which enlargement takes place. Enlargement takes place in the European Union through a number of stages. The first of these major enlargements takes place in 1973. We see the introduction of new states such as Denmark, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. And then at the same time, there was the possibility that Norway could join the European Economic Community, but then this was put to a referendum vote in Norway and was rejected. Norway is still still not a member of the European Union. Greece would join the European Economic Community in 1981, and in 1985 there was something known as the Schengen Agreement. The Schengen Agreement is a major breakthrough in terms of the integration of European economies, namely the free movement of peoples. The purpose of the Schengen Agreement was to establish a zone within the European Economic Community where there would be complete frictionless travel among member states. It means that if you were in the Schengen zone, you would be able to travel between member states without there being border checks or passport controls. This, the aim of which was to ensure the complete free movement of peoples, as therefore being able to essentially solidify one of the major principles of the Europeans' economic constitution and establish part of the single market, which is what we'll get to in future lessons time, don't you worry. Between 1993 and 2009, we have the sort of Maastricht to Lisbon treaties. So the Maastricht Treaty in 1992 formally establishes what is known today as the European Union. So it changes the name to the European Union. It was entered into force in November 1993, and the general idea behind the future of the Union was to, firstly, expand into new competences, so to expand into new regulatory competences, and then also to expand into new territories. Specifically, the plan was to enable further enlargement of the Union to include Cyprus and Malta. But then there was a whole host of newly established post-Soviet states, because in post-1993, well, post-1989 to 1991, there was the establishment of multiple different of post-Soviet states. You had Poland, you had Latvia, Lithuania, you had Romania, you had Ukraine, which is still in the process of joining. And you obviously had the Russian Federation as well. So all of these new states in Eastern Europe became open ground and open territory for potential enlargement to the European Union. The new wave of members would join in and around the time of the Treaty of Lisbon, 2008-2009. You see Bulgaria and Romania join in 2007, Cyprus and Malta would join in 2008, Slovakia would join in 2009, Estonia in 2011, Latvia in 2014, Lithuania in 2015. The Treaty of Lisbon would be agreed upon in 2007, and that would enter into force in 2009. One of the major things that the Treaty of Lisbon did was do a number of structural reforms to the Union. It, for example, merged the system of the European Union's three pillars. It also created the position of the President of the European Council and allowed for the establishment of a single union with legal personality. So it made a number of legal and structural and constitutional changes to the European Union. Finally, then, we're coming up to near about the present day, and we have the constriction of the concept of the European Union with the idea of Brexit. Following a referendum result which took place in June, I believe, or July of 2016, from what I can recall, I'm surprised it isn't etched into my memory as a traumatic period of my life, the UK ultimately votes to leave the European Union. And what followed was a complex series of negotiations and processes which would ultimately lead to a formal withdrawal from the Union in 2020, in January 2020. What happened then was that there would be an entering into the transition process. The transition process essentially allowed the UK to remain part of the single market, while a formal and more substantial trade agreement was established, which was negotiated until the 31st of December 2020.